There are 39 people on death row in the state of Oklahoma. Joseph Fidel Alanese, 2 years on death row. In the April 24, 2018 death of Brittany Young, 27 years old, a Cleveland County jury found 32-year-old Joseph Fidel Alanese guilty of first-degree murder, 1 count of robbery by force or intimidation, and 2 counts of kidnapping. Alanese repeatedly trampled on Young while she was inside her home, killing her. Young, who was an ex-girlfriend, had let him stay with her as he traveled from Texas to Oklahoma. Soon after Young's death, inside one of the Emerald Greens apartments, Norman police responded. After Alanese left the area, a search was conducted. He was located that evening, taken into custody by Oklahoma City Police Department personnel, and transferred to Norman to be questioned. Brenda Andrew and James Pavet, 18 years on death row. Robert Andrew, Brenda's husband, was shot twice with a 16-gauge shotgun, once by Brenda and once by her lover, James Pavet. Brenda and Rob were high school sweethearts and had 2 children together. She was a stay-at-home mom and she taught Sunday school. Everything was going great in their family. By the time she hit 40, she developed what some would call a middle-age crisis, and that's when she and her husband decided to separate. Rob visited in November 2001 to pick up the kids, and then he went into the garage to assist Brenda with lighting the furnace pilot. Brenda dialed 911 a short while later. She had been hurt and her spouse had been fatally shot. They were ambushed in their garage, she said to the authorities, by 2 males with guns. Brenda had been having an affair with James Pavet, a fellow church member and insurance salesman, according to the investigation conducted by the police shortly after the incident. Rob had just purchased a $1 million life insurance policy from James. Additionally, according to friends, Rob had started to suspect something was off with his wife and the insurance salesman and was afraid for his life. Brenda and James were gone when the police arrived to arrest them. The pair was apprehended at the Mexican border 3 months later. Miles Sterling Bench, 10 years on death row. In May of 2012, Bench started working at the TP Totem convenience store in the Stevens County community of Velma. He was 21. Around 7:30 p.m., 16-year-old Braley Henry drove into Velma to pick up something from the grocery store. Henry finished this task and proceeded into the TP Totem to get a drink from the soda fountain and some candies. Henry was at the fountain filling a cup when Bench struck her. She was knocked to the ground by a blow from him. Henry was taken inside the store's stockroom after he choked her. She was in excellent form and played basketball for her school. After entering the storage, she retaliated. Bench launched another assault on Henry. He struck her several times. Bench pounded Henry's head, face, neck, and chest mercilessly. Her head hit the floor as Bench pulled her across the room. He stomped his shoe on her upper back, arm, neck, and head. She was killed as a result of Bench's ongoing brutality. She died from blunt force injuries to her head and neck, asphyxiating on the blood in her lungs. Ben then started taking action to hide his crime and escape to California. Henry's body was placed inside a shopping cart and a sack was wrapped around her head. Bench moved the cart outside to Henry's car, covered Henry's body with boxes, and put her body in the back seat. From the store's shelves, Bench took razors, rubbing alcohol, peanut butter, sunflower seeds, and toothbrushes and packed them in the car. He took Henry's car to a somewhat remote location on his grandparents' property, where he pulled out her body from the car. Henry was stripped by Bench down to the waist, revealing her chest through her jacket, tank top, and sports bra. Henry's body was moved to a muddy area of the field, where he partially covered it with grass and soil. Bench entered his grandparents' house, changed out of his shirt, and gathered more supplies for his journey, such as his wallet, footwear, clothes, and hydrogen peroxide. Stanley Bench, Bench's grandfather, saw that it was unusually early for him to be coming home from work, and inquired as to whether he had quit or have been fired. Bench only said yes. He told Mr. Bench he was going out. He went outside and used the water spigot to wash himself. "Pa, I love you," he exclaimed, poking his head back inside the door after finishing. The absence of Bench from the business was looked into by the Stevens County Sheriff's Department. In addition to taking pictures of the convenience store's interior, Deputy Michael Moore also collected a DNA sample from the bloody mess in the storeroom. Deputy David Martin visited Bench's grandparents' house to inquire about Bench's well-being. Lieutenant Chad Powell found Henry's naked body in a nearby field using canine police. Shan Michael Bossy, 11 years on death row. A McLean County jury found Bossy guilty of killing a single mother and her 2 little children at their home close to Dibble. The woman met Bossy online, according to trial testimony, and the two had a brief romantic relationship that Bossy told investigators was not serious at all. According to autopsy results, Katrina Griffin, 25 years old, and her son Christian, 8 years old, perished from multiple stab wounds, while Chastity, 6 years old, perished from burns and smoke inhalation after their mobile home was set on fire. The girl was allegedly stuck in a closet with a chair blocking the door, according to the prosecution. Prosecutors said that in addition to the blood evidence, pawn tickets discovered in Bossy's wallet also connected him to the crimes. They demonstrated how Bossy had sold more than 100 family heirlooms at 7 Oklahoma City pawn shops early on July 23, 2010, during the time the Griffin home was on fire. 42 DVDs and a few games were among those things. The majority of the games had the letters KRG on them. Ronson Kyle Bush, 14 years on death row. The state of Oklahoma sentenced Bush to death for a homicide. Court records state that Ronson Bush shot William Edward Harrington 6 times before killing him. According to forensic pathologist Dr. Inas Yakub, Harrington was most likely lying on his stomach when one shot, the fatal one, went through his back. Harrington appeared to stumble outside before falling, as evidenced by bloody footprints and the trail of blood going away from his mobile home. According to District Attorney Brett Burns, Bush dragged his victim in a heinous and atrocious manner and with extreme cruelty because of the rope that was discovered around Harrington's ankle and the blunt force injuries that damaged his face. Carlos Cuesta Rodriguez, 16 years on death row. Cuesta Rodriguez received a death sentence for shooting Olympia Cardina Fisher twice, once in each eye, at their house in South Oklahoma City. After inflicting Fisher, who was 47 years old, a gunshot wound to the eye, he waited for almost 8 minutes before taking the fatal shot to the opposite eye. The second shot was fired when Oklahoma City police were outside the residence. It was shortly after they heard someone scream horribly and beat on a window. In 1980, Cuesta Rodriguez fled Cuba's poverty to establish a new life in the United States. A drug conviction 3 years later had derailed his hopes of becoming a citizen and relocating to the United States with his wife and son, but this had not destroyed his ambition. When Cuesta Rodriguez was released from prison in 1988, he put a lot of effort into making a name for himself in Oklahoma City. With Fisher, he believed he had finally found happiness. However, Cuesta Rodriguez's regret prevented him from experiencing happiness for very long. Fisher distanced herself from him after he accused her of being unfaithful, which increased tension in their relationship. Dustin Davidson, 5 years on death row. The state of Oklahoma sentenced Davidson to death for the murder of the 2-year-old son of his ex-girlfriend. Davidson was meant to be taking care of Creedon Paul Brooks while his mother was at work, but according to court filings, he beat the youngster to death. The child had 49 bruises below the neck, a fractured jawbone, cerebral hemorrhage, and a fractured skull. Despite their split, Davidson consented to watch Creedon while Young was at work. According to the prosecution, Davidson may have hit the child out of resentment that Young was seeing someone else. Daryl Frederick, 8 years on death row. An Oklahoma County jury found Daryl Wayne Frederick guilty of killing his mother, Connie Bernice Frederick, 87-year-old, in the first degree. He was found guilty by the jury of 2 more violent offenses resulting from the same Northeast Oklahoma City incident, and they condemned him to death as well as an extra 26 years. Frederick started fighting with Connie Frederick on March 26, 2011. He used the brick to chase after his niece after she ran out of the house. He went back into the house, and his mother was found soon after with severe swelling to her face and head. She was taken to the hospital, but she passed away on April 30, 2011. Ronnie Eugene Fon, 6 years on death row. Fon, a member of a gang, was found guilty of first-degree murder in connection with the shooting death of Michael Donnell Rhodes, 58 years old, on October 20, 2012. Prosecutors said that on the day of the shooting, Foston traveled to Oklahoma City to assist several female gang members in resolving a conflict with Rhodes's niece. Prosecutors claimed that that evening, Foston and other individuals went to Rhodes's home in northwest Oklahoma City to confront the niece. Foston opened fire inside the house 5 times after the door was kicked in, hitting Rhodes 3 times while he was lying on the couch with his 3-year-old daughter. The toddler was discovered covered in her father's blood. Prosecutors claimed that ballistic and telephone evidence linked Foston to the crime. According to authorities, Foston later boasted about the shooting incident. Richard Glossip, 27 years on death row. Barry Van Treese was killed by Justin Sneed on January 7, 1997, with a baseball bat. The murder took place at the Best Budget Inn in Oklahoma City, where Glossip was the manager. Sneed was the maintenance worker and Van Treese was the hotel's owner. Sneed confessed and admitted to the police that Glossip had given him the order to kill the victim in exchange for being spared the death penalty. Glossip resisted taking a plea deal because he claimed he was truly innocent. A jury in Oklahoma found Glossip guilty of the murder in July 1998, and they also gave him the death penalty. The conviction was overturned in 2001 by the unanimous Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals, which described the prosecution's evidence as very poor and said Glossip had unconstitutionally inadequate legal representation. A second Oklahoma jury found Glossip guilty of the murder in August 2004 and gave him the death penalty. Glossip claimed that his defense attorney had resigned because of intimidation by the prosecution. However, the Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals upheld the death penalty in April 2007, with 2 judges voting in favor, 1 judge specifically concurring, and 2 judges against. Sister Helen Pregine advocated for Glossip, but she was unsuccessful in persuading the clemency board to take into account letters from Sneed's relatives who think Sneed was lying. This execution is controversial because Glossip was almost entirely convicted based on Sneed's testimony, which he used to avoid the death penalty himself. Wade Greeley Lay, 19 years on death row. Mr. Lay and his son Chris Lay attempted to rob a bank in Tulsa, Oklahoma in May 2004. The Lays entered the bank armed and covered in ski masks and gloves. Chris gave the command for the bank employee to fall to the ground right away, drawing the security guard's attention. The security guard died as a result of a shootout. The Lays were hurt and escaped without any money. They did not travel very far. Later that day, authorities caught them. September 2005 saw the trial of the Lays collectively. Mr. Lay opted to act on his own behalf while Chris was represented by legal counsel. They both acknowledged their wrongdoing, but they said their acts were acceptable since the government had grown oppressive and they needed the money from the bank to fund the patriotic revolution like the Founding Fathers did. First-degree murder and the gun-related attempted robbery were found to have been committed by Chris and Mr. Lay. Chris was given a life sentence without the possibility of parole, while Mr. Lay was given a death penalty. Emmanuel Littlejohn, 31 years on death row. Littlejohn and Glenn Bethany robbed the Ruth and Scott in Oklahoma City while they were both 20 years old. Kenneth Mears, a 31-year-old victim of the heist, was slain as he approached the perpetrators with a broom. Littlejohn received a death sentence, while Bethany received a life sentence in jail. Littlejohn acknowledges taking part in the heist but claims not to have fired the fatal shot that struck Mears. Littlejohn had requested the Supreme Court to review whether his death sentence was lawful, since the jury had not been informed that his brain damage from his mother's extreme drug and alcohol misuse during his pregnancy could have been a possible explanation for his criminal behavior. Richard Norman Roem, 39 years on death row. Layla Dawn Cummings, his former stepdaughter, was 7-year-old when Richard Roem essayed, abducted, and killed her. Layla was taken from the apartment she shared with her mother Mindy Cummings and her brother Jason Cummings between 10 p.m. on July 6 and 1:15 a.m. on July 7. When Rick Quimby, who worked at a motel across the street, went to check on the kids, he discovered Layla was missing and informed Mindy at work. When Jason's mother left for work, he went to sleep, but when he heard the disturbance, he woke up. He said in court that he didn't hear any cries or struggle, but did saw Rick. Jason told his father, Don Cummings, in court that he believed Layla was with Rick, but he did not see or hear anything. Don Cummings is Layla and Jason's father. On July 7, a farmer discovered Layla's body in a field. She was killed by neck stab wounds. She had also suffered a stab wound to her private areas. Blood had drenched the ground 2 to 3 inches beneath her neck and chest, as well as the area around the crotch of her nightgown. The skin on her buttocks was torn and scratched with nails. Although she had suffered blunt force injuries in her private areas, no genetic material was discovered in her body. The majority of the information linking Roem to the crime was circumstantial. He recently divorced Mindy and made an effort to patch things up. He was aware of her work schedule and the malfunctioning apartment door lock. Near the flat, a plastic cup with his fingerprints on it was discovered. His beer had been put in a comparable cup and he had left the bar between 11:50 and 12:20. Roem contacted his workplace at 1:14 a.m. and asked the dispatcher to record the call at 12:35 a.m. Later on, he asked that the call be recorded at the proper time. The outside packaging of a condom was discovered by the police in Layla's nightgown's folds. An order form packed with that brand of condoms was also found at the crime site. Police discovered the condom packet and the used condom containing genetic material when they investigated Roem's room. This made up the entirety of a condom package. The washroom at the bar where Roem had been featured a dispenser selling this generic brand of condoms. Just before leaving the bar, he had gone to the bathroom. The 2 rear tires and 1 front tire of Roem's car were identified by tire track impressions close to the body. The other front tire's track impressions did not match the one on Roem's vehicle. However, the state provided evidence that Roem had changed that tire on July 7 in the morning. The other tires were 15-inch non-radials, whereas that one was a 14-inch radial. Roem had requested that a co-worker inform the police that he and another employee had changed Roem's tire following a blowout. The police may have a tire they used to put me in jail, Roem warned the co-worker, and if you don't tell them you changed the tire, it'll be death punishment and 2 lives instead of 1. The co-worker refused to lie. Roem claimed to have owned the car the entire time and that it had been involved in a homicide, according to a different co-worker. James Ryder, 24 years on death row. Sam and Daisy Hallam hired Ryder in the second half of 1998 to look after their house and horses while they were away. For roughly 4 to 5 months, Ryder resided at the Hallam's house without paying rent in exchange for labor he did around the house. Ryder told his friends that he was going to Yukon, and in preparation for the journey, he kept his supplies at the Hallam's house. These items included a trailer, tools, and camping and survival gear. He attempted to recover his belongings from the Hallams upon his return to the state. In order to perform a standby at the Hallam residence on April 2, 1999, Pittsburgh County Sheriff's Deputy Arnold was sent to meet Ryder at Highway 9A and McNally Road. Ryder identified himself and informed Deputy Arnold that he needed to get some personal items from the Hallams. Daisy answered the door when Arnold rang the bell. She gave Arnold a friendly greeting before slamming the door in Ryder's face. Daisy Hallam expressed her distaste for Ryder to Deputy Arnold and said that none of his possessions were present. She promised to bring the stuff there the next day and said it was in storage. Deputy Arnold and Ryder agreed to get together the following day at the same time to get the items. In the storage facility, Ryder only discovered 2 empty boxes. He went back to Cindy McCord's house where he was staying, and from the garage he took a shotgun and a pistol. On April 9, shortly after 9 a.m., Michael Newman, a neighbor of the Hallams, made the decision to visit the Hallams' home to get a welding equipment. He saw Sam Hallam face down in the front yard as he pulled into the driveway. Sam was stiff and he was dripping blood. Mr. Newman hurried home and dialed 911 the moment he discovered Sam was dead. Daisy Hallam was discovered in a shallow depression, lying face down, around 100 yards from the house. She was partially covered in a shower curtain. Daisy suffered a beating in the home's living room. The 70-year-old woman's head and face were covered with multiple cuts and bruises. She had a fractured skull, a broken nose, and a damaged left cheekbone. Her hands were battered, and some of her fingers were shattered, broken, and on the verge of being severed. These wounds were referred to as defensive wounds by the specialists, who claimed that they showed the woman had covered her face with her hands. A blow to the head was determined to be the cause of her death. According to the expert's testimony, 38-year-old Sam Hallam was shot multiple times. He was found to have at least 12 sizable shotgun pellets inside him. His heart, lungs, stomach, liver, pancreas, spleen, and left adrenal gland were all hit by bullets. Sam was walking when he was shot, according to the gunshot wounds, and was facing the home at the time. The wounds to his chest and abdomen were determined to be the cause of death. Michael Dwayne Smith, 22 years on death row. Michael Dwayne Smith is a part of the Oak Grove Pose, an Oklahoma City-based branch of the Crips gang. Teron Armstrong and 2 other OGP members attempted to loot Trans Food Mart in South Oklahoma City in November 2000. Armstrong was slain by gunfire from the store owner. Even though Smith had deep personal ties to Armstrong, he was not a part of the heist. After being apprehended, the other 2 would-be thieves were scheduled to stand trial for the crime in February 2002. Smith entered Janet Moore's residence with a revolver 2 days prior to the trial. Smith broke down Mrs. Moore's door and confronted her, thinking her son was a police informant. He shot her dead when she started to scream. Smith cleaned the apartment to remove any traces of his fingerprints before leaving. He then walked to the AZ Mart, a convenience shop directly next door to Trans Food Mart. Sarat Puluru, the store's on-duty employee, was emptied 2 pistols into by Smith, who also stole money from the register and lit fires all around the store with lighter fluid. And in order to destroy any trace of evidence, he set fire to Mr. Puluru's body and everything he had touched in the AZ Mart. He then disposed of the clothing he had been wearing while committing the killings. He was apprehended, convicted, and sentenced to death. Kevin Ray Underwood, 17 years on death row. Jamie Rose Bolin, a 10-year-old girl who had gone missing and for whom an Amber Alert had been issued, was being sought by authorities. On April 17, 2006, Underwood, who shared an apartment building with Bolin, was taken into custody. He told Oklahoma detectives and FBI officials that he had killed Bolin and tried to sever her head off. "Go ahead and arrest me. She is in there. I chopped her up." Following Underwood's admission, Bolin's body was found in his bedroom closet, hidden inside a sizable plastic container. According to Purcell Police Chief David Tompkins, Underwood's fantasies to kidnap a person, essay them, torment them, kill them, chop off their head, drain the body of blood, essay the corpse, devour the corpse, then dispose of the parts and bones, came to fruition with Bolin's murder. Underwood was found guilty of killing the girl by striking her with a wooden chopping board. Police reported finding barbecue skewers and meat tenderizers at the scene, which they believe were meant to be used on the victim's corpse. A jury found him guilty of first-degree murder on February 29, 2008. On March 7, the jury recommended the death punishment. Daniel Vasquez, 2 years on death row. Authorities found the body of 23-year-old Shalila Toombs, who was 7 months pregnant, on May 2, 2018. Vasquez proceeded to a convenience store and informed the police officer that the pickup had run out of gas and that there was a body in the back. This is how investigators learned about the body, which was discovered inside the pickup. On April 29, about 1 in the morning, Vasquez went to Toombs' house. Subsequently, 30-year-old Joshua Finkbeiner and 42-year-old Stacy Harjo showed up, looking for a backpack they claimed Toombs had taken. Vasquez claimed to have discovered that Toombs had borrowed Harjo's car, which was equipped with that backpack that held Finkbeiner's employee's hard drive. Investigators were informed by Vasquez that Finkbeiner and Harjo had put him and Toombs in a pickup at gunpoint and taken them to a farm. Toombs' mother stated that she received a text message from her daughter at 4:50 a.m. that read, "They gonna kill me, Mom, help me." They didn't spend much time at the farm before they started driving around. Finkbeiner started choking Toombs while they were driving, and he did so for about 20 minutes. Vasquez informed investigators that Harjo had given him the order to finish her off shortly after. Before he started choking Toombs, Vasquez claimed to have looked for a pulse and believes she was already dead, according to the affidavit. The three then talked of burning the pickup and throwing Toombs' body into a lake. David Ware, 1 year on death row. In connection with the death of Tulsa Police Sergeant Craig Johnson, David Ware received a death sentence. On June 10, 2020, he shot and injured Officer Orash Zarkeshan during the same traffic stop. Policemen can be seen attempting to remove Ware from the car in body camera footage from the incident, when Ware produces a revolver and shoots both policemen, while Officer Zarkeshan, who was shot in the head, spent around 4 months healing in an out-of-state rehab center before going back to work, Sergeant Johnson passed away from his wounds. Termain Wood, 19 years on death row. In 2001, Wood was found guilty of killing Ronnie Whipf in the first degree. For the crime, his brother Jake Wood was given a life sentence. Jake claimed he was the one who fatally stabbed Whipf. In addition to not being the one who killed Whipf, Termain Wood's attorneys claimed that their client should be granted post-conviction relief because the trial lawyer assigned by the court was dependent on drugs, alcohol, and cocaine during the case. Byron James Shepard, 4 years on death row. Officer Turney, 22 years old, passed away on March 27, 2017, as a result of gunshot wounds he sustained the previous evening after a confrontation with Shepard, a passenger in a car that Turney had stopped. That evening, Shepard, a wanted man on the run, shot Turney in order to escape being arrested. Shepard's criminal history, prior acts of violence, and drug use were highlighted by the prosecution. His public lawyers requested that the jury spare his life and sentence him to life in prison, arguing that the gunfire and the officer's death were unintentional. Kendrick Simpson, 16 years on death row. Glenn Palmer, 20 years old, and Anthony Jones, 19 years old, were killed at a nightclub in Oklahoma City, and Simpson was found guilty of their murders. There was also another man hurt. Simpson opened fire on the males who were in a car traveling on Pennsylvania Avenue close to I-44 with up to 25 rounds from a semi-automatic rifle. Simpson was given 2 death sentences. His 2 companion men agreed to plea deals in exchange for 20-year jail sentences. Ricky Malone, 18 years on death row. In connection with Trooper Nikki Joe Green's death on December 26, 2003, Ricky Ray Malone was found guilty of first-degree murder. Following a struggle on a Cotton County road, Green was shot twice in the back of the head. Malone admitted in court that he was running a methamphetamine mobile lab out of a car. Green slapped a handcuff on one of Malone's wrists, then came close to the car and struggled for his gun. Green was shot with his own weapon. Green's dashboard-mounted video camera caught parts of the crime. Malone said that at the time of the murder, he was high on drugs and believed he was defending himself against a robber. He said that voices in his head instructed him to shoot 35-year-old Green. Micah Alexander Martinez, 10 years on death row. Martinez was found guilty in the October 2009 killings of Carl Miller, 64 years old, and Martha Miller, 55 years old, at their home. Martinez broke into the house, essayed the woman, and then killed both her and her husband. Testimony stated that the Millers died from blows to the head. Faye Miller passed away the day of the attack. Carl Miller passed away in a hospital 4 days later. Martinez remained silent when the Miller's son, Sean Monk, related an altercation with an intruder at the house. Monk, 33 years old, claimed that when he woke up on early October 12, he heard someone breaking into his mother's bedroom and shouting profanities. His mother was unconscious at the foot of the bed with her pants pulled down around her ankles, and he recounted how he hurried into the hallway to see the intruder exiting the bedroom shirtless. He found his father on the blood-spattered garage floor. Alfred Brian Mitchell, 31 years on death row. Elaine Marie Scott was essayed and killed by Alfred Mitchell, who had just been let out of a state reform school. Mitchell had previously been found guilty of essay. Elaine Marie Scott, who was 21 at the time, was killed by a wooden coat tree on January 7, 1991, with such force that her parents were told not to view her body. Scott was a part-time counselor for poor children at Oklahoma City's Pilot Recreation Community Center when the attack occurred. At the time, Mitchell was just 18 years old. In addition to fibers from his jacket lodged in her fingernails, investigators discovered Mitchell's blood on Scott's body. Alton Alexander Nolan, 6 years on death row. Nolan was found guilty of beheading 54-year-old Colleen Hufford at Vaughan Foods in 2014 and given the death penalty. Prosecutors claimed that after being suspended from his employment at the facility for making threatening remarks to co-workers, Nolan killed Hufford and injured another employee. Hufford, 54 years old, was initially attacked by him when he grabbed her from behind while she was speaking with a Vaughan Foods supervisor. He cut her throat, saying, "Die, bitch, die," according to the testimony. When 3 men attempted to stop him, he beat them off. He then launched an attack on Tracy Johnson, a recent hire at the facility, who had filed a complaint regarding his racist remarks, which resulted in his termination. When Nolan was shot by the plant's then chief operating officer, who broke up the attack, she managed to survive. Nolan stated in court and to psychologists that he wanted to be put to death due to his strong religious convictions. Jurors also heard that he told the FBI he knew he was going to heaven and he had no regrets. Derek Don Posi, 4 years on death row. The jury decided that Derek Don Posi should be put to death for the 2013 murder of a young Calumet woman and her 5-year-old son. After breaking into Amy Gibbons's house and essaying her in the middle of the night, he struck the 22-year-old victim in the head. Briar, her trapped son, was killed when Posi set the small house on fire. On June 16, 2013, their bodies were discovered inside the house. The defense team begged for leniency, citing proof that Posi's mother had mistreated and neglected him as a child. Posi and Amy Gibbons had crossed paths in a pub, so they were acquaintances. At the time, he was employed on an oil rig close to Calumet. Because he took her debit card and used it to empty her bank account, he was marked as a suspect. A week later, he was taken into custody in Tulsa. DNA evidence connected him to the crime even further. At first, investigators believed the fire was unintentional. However, a bank employee discovered the unusual outlaw of cash. This discovery made more research necessary. In state history, the trial was one of the lengthiest in a criminal case. In order to justify their plea for the death penalty, prosecutors presented a substantial amount of information regarding Posi's past offenses, including essays. During the sentencing phase, defense counsel called over 30 witnesses to bolster their case for a life sentence without the possibility of parole. It took the jury just 3 hours to reach a unanimous decision to execute Posi. William Reese, 2 years on death row. For the killings of Laura Smither, Kelly Cox, Tiffany Johnston, and Jessica Kane, it took almost 20 years for William Reese to be brought to justice. William Reese was released from jail in the fall of 1996, having spent almost 10 years behind bars for abusing 2 women in his home state of Oklahoma. Following his release, Reese lived with his mother in Anadarko, Oklahoma for a short while before relocating to Harris County, Texas, where he worked as a construction worker and farrier, fitting shoes for horses. In 1997, he traveled frequently between his mother's Oklahoman house and his new Texas residence. 12-year-old Laura Smither, an aspiring ballerina, went for a morning jog near her Friendswood, Texas home on April 3, 1997, but she never came back. With the aid of their community, countless volunteers and even the U.S. Marines, Gay and Bob Smither, looked for their daughter for days, but they were unable to locate her. A father and son walking their dogs discovered Laura Smither's decomposing remains in a retention pond 12 miles from her house after 17 days of searching. Her cause of death was unknown after several weeks in the water. In spite of this heartbreaking information, a suspect surfaced fast. It was William Reese, who worked at a building site not far from the Friendswood home of the Smithers. Reese was under observation and his truck was searched in relation to Laura's case. But at the time, police lacked sufficient evidence to make an arrest, thus he remained a free man. Sandra Sepow, then 19 years old, made a stop at a convenience store by I-45 on May 16, 1997. When Sepow encountered the same man across the street at the Waffle House restaurant, he volunteered to assist her with a recently found flat tire. Sepow claims that she saw the man looking at her in the parking lot. This confused her, who claims that the guy pushed her into his white pickup vehicle and essayed her before she realized what was going on. He took her in his pickup and drove off down the freeway. Sandra leaped out of the moving truck and into the middle of the highway, scared for her life if she stayed. Despite suffering severe injuries from the fall, she lived. As part of her criminal justice class, 20-year-old mother Kelly Cox was given a tour of the Denton Police Department on July 15, 1997. However, she had to leave early to take an exam. Not long after leaving, Cox realized she was locked out of her car and called her boyfriend for assistance via a payphone at a nearby gas station. However, she was nowhere to be found when he arrived. Later that day, Jen Bynum, Cox's mother, said she sensed something was really wrong when Kelly forgot to pick up her toddler from daycare. Kelly Cox was a committed student who enrolled in summer courses with the goal of earning her social work degree early. She embraced becoming a young mother to her daughter Alexis wholeheartedly. Jan Bynum, Kelly's mother, understood that her daughter Kelly would never leave Alexis behind, since she was Cox's entire universe. Even so, Bynum's days of looking extended into weeks, and she was unable to determine her daughter's exact fate, despite her best attempts. The case went cold, with no corpse and no solid leads. Tiffany Johnston, then 19 years old and recently married, disappeared in broad daylight from a car wash in Bethany, Oklahoma on July 26, 1997. Her floor mats remained on the drying racks, her keys in the ignition, but Tiffany was nowhere to be found, and nobody at the car wash saw anything unusual that day. Kathy Dobry, Tiffany's mother, was confused and worried what had become of her youngest daughter. The body of Tiffany Johnston was discovered partially dressed in dense grass off an unpaved country road near the highway the next day. Her last known location was the car wash, about 15 miles away. She'd been essayed and strangled. Although her body contained the killer's DNA, investigators were unable to use it to create a suspect profile at the time. Jessica Kane, 17 years old, was last seen leaving a restaurant in Clear Lake, Texas, when she went out with friends about 3 weeks after Tiffany Johnston was murdered. Jessica's father went looking for her after she skipped curfew. A few miles from their house, on the shoulder of I-45, he discovered his daughter's truck abandoned after hours of searching. Jessica was nowhere to be found. Friends and search parties searched for any indication of Jessica, but they were unsuccessful. Only 4 months after losing their own daughter Laura, Gay and Bob Smither, who were still coming to terms with her death, jumped into the hunt right away. Investigators were left without leads after weeks of looking for answers, and Jessica's case became cold as well. In a meeting with Frieswood police 5 months after Sandra Sepa was kidnapped, Webster detectives learned that Sepau's description of her kidnapper's car resembled the truck that had been searched by police in Laura Smither's case, which belonged to William Reese. When Reese was brought in for a lineup on October 16, 1997, Sepau recognized him as her assailant. William Reese's background reared its head during his trial for Sandra Sepau's kidnapping. In addition to Sandra's compelling evidence, Reese's victims from the 1980s spoke before the jury, detailing their respective horrible attacks at the hands of the man in Oklahoma. After less than 3 hours of deliberation, the jury convicted Reese. He received a 60-year prison term. Tiffany Johnston's case was given to retired police officer Lynn Williams when she began working for the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigations in 2012. After carefully reviewing the case file, Williams concluded that their greatest chance of identifying Johnston's killer was using DNA from the crime scene. Although Johnston's remains had previously undergone 2 unsuccessful tests of its DNA, advances in the technology allowed criminologist Wendy Duke and her team to create a partial male profile. The investigators eliminated every other suspect until they arrived at William Reese by comparing this incomplete profile to the profiles of known suspects. William Reese provided a mouth swab in December 2013, which was sent for comparison. Wendy Duke was able to link Reese's DNA to that found in Tiffany's body after obtaining his sample, and Reese's involvement could not be ruled out. The state of Oklahoma issued an arrest warrant for William Reese on September 22, 2015, in connection with the murder and kidnapping of Tiffany Johnston. Texas detectives were informed by Oklahoma authorities of their latest DNA discovery, and they were hoping to talk to Reese about a possible link to the crimes of Laura Smither, Kelly Cox, and Jessica Kane. When Texas detectives visited Reese in jail, he demanded that the death penalty be removed before he would talk to them further. Jan Bynum agreed, as did the Smithers. They all wanted to know what had happened to their girls. Reese ultimately admitted to all 4 killings, even though his only agreement was to forego the death punishment in the cases of Kelly Cox and Laura Smither. After 25 days of excavating, Jessica Kane's bones were found in a field on East Orem Drive, close to Hobby Airport, with some assistance from William Reese. In neighboring Brazoria County, Kelly Cox's bones were discovered 2 weeks after Jessica's remains were found. Jan Bynum finally received answers after years of wondering what had happened to her daughter and Alexa's mother. Jan had Kelly's bracelet turned into a locket after discovering it alongside her remains. Oklahoma prosecutors requested that Reese be sent to their state in order to prosecute him for Tiffany Johnston's murder and kidnapping. Reese presented a not guilty plea, despite the fact that prosecutors had DNA evidence connecting him to Tiffany Johnston and his confession. Following 9 days of deliberation, the jury returned a guilty verdict in less than 2 hours, finding Reese guilty of Tiffany Johnston's murder. He received a death sentence. The families of Laura Smither, Kelly Cox, and Jessica Kane finally had their day in court 25 years after the murders. William Reese was given 3 life sentences, 1 for each murder, after entering a guilty plea in Galveston and Brazoria counties. Clarence Good, 18 years on death row. 3 people, including a 10-year-old child, were killed in Owasso in 2005, and Clarence Roselle Good was found guilty of their deaths. In connection with the deaths of Mitch Thompson, Tara Burkett Thompson, and Tara's 10-year-old daughter Kayla, Good was one of 3 men charged with first-degree murder. The men and Thompson got into a fight, which got problematic to the point that the men came into the house with guns and shot each of the victims many times. After a separate trial, a Tulsa County jury found Good guilty of all 3 counts of murder. For each of the 3, he received the death penalty. Wendel Grom, 15 years on death row. Grissom drove his white Chevrolet truck out of Arkansas and onto Interstate 40, heading west on November 2, 2005. He picked up a hitchhiker named Jesse Johns, who was homeless just beyond the state line in Oklahoma. The 2 men drank whiskey and got to know one another while traveling west. They also talked about robbing or breaking into properties in order to raise money. Grissom paid $260 for a weekly rental when they checked into a hotel in Oklahoma City later that evening. That night, Jesse Johns slept on the floor. Wendel Grissom demonstrated how to load a black powder handgun with a .44 caliber to Jesse Johns the next morning. This was one of the 2 guns that he had with him at the moment. On their way west on Interstate 40 in the vehicle that morning, the 2 men continued to drink. Their trip at the Love's Country store on exit 108 at approximately 10:45 a.m. saw each man purchasing a pair of brown cotton gloves, as captured by security cameras. From there, they searched for a house to break into by driving into rural Blaine County. Grissom parked his truck in the driveway of Matt and Drew Kopp's house in rural Blaine County close to Hitchcock. He gave Jesse Jones instructions to hold off on helping him break into the residence until the gunfire had stopped. Grissom went up to a sliding door in the back of the house and tapped. That morning, Drew Kopf, her best friend Amber Matthews, and her 2 small daughters, Riley, age 18 months, and Gracie Joe, age 1, were inside her home. Gracie was being held by Mrs. Kopf while Riley was in her cot in the bedroom. As Mrs. Kopf turned in her glider rocker to talk with Grissom, Mrs. Matthews answered the sliding glass door. He asked Mrs. Kopf if her husband was home. She replied that her husband was at work. Grissom promised to return at a later time. After Mrs. Matthews shut the door, Grissom reappeared a short while later. After giving the infant to Mrs. Matthews, Mrs. Kopf went back to the door. Grissom broke through the huge glass pane by shooting towards it. Then he entered the house and shot Mrs. Kopf a second time, hitting her in the hand. The infant and Amber Matthews rushed into Riley's bedroom. After a struggle, Mrs. Kopf shoved the intruder onto a couch across the room. She begged Grissom to take what he wanted and go, as she was on top of him struggling. Taking the black powder pistol from his belt and putting it to her head, he simply chuckled at her. As he shot, she reached for the gun, but a bullet broke through her fingers and pierced her skull on the side. Grissom then fired again, jamming the large pistol into her hip. Mrs. Kopf was thrown to the ground by the force of this shot. Wendel Grissom made his way to the bedroom where Mrs. Matthews and the kids were. The report from Grissom's pistol and Mrs. Matthews pleading for her life were then heard by Mrs. Kopf. After breaking out of the house, Mrs. Kopf went to her garage and opened the overhead door. She realized she could not run and that she was giving her killer a trail of blood to follow. She bolted toward the road after spotting the white truck in her driveway. Jesse Jones had heard multiple gunshots and had exited the truck to approach the home. He watched as Mrs. Kopf fled the residence. As soon as he passed through the broken door, Grissom was standing over an injured Amber Matthews. He watched as Mrs. Matthews was hit by another round of fire by Grissom. Grissom was then informed by Jones that someone had fled the house. Running towards the truck, Wendel Grissom attempted to climb inside and shot Mrs. Kopf once more with his pistol as she drove away. Not far from her home, Drew Kopf stopped 3 truck drivers who were moving rock and informed them that she had been shot along with her children and friend. One of the truck drivers, a retired police officer himself, got into the vehicle. He drove Mrs. Kopf to the hospital in neighboring Watonga after reporting the shooting over the phone to the Kingfisher County Sheriff's Office. Wendel Grissom and Johns tried to flee the crime scene on a red 4-wheeler ATV they discovered in the Kopf family garage after realizing their plans had been disrupted. A postal worker noticed a black dog pursuing 2 men on the red 4-wheeler as they left the Kopf home. The criminals sped by the rock haulers, who had just moments before encountered Drew Kopf. After a short while, the men ran out of gas, but they were able to catch a ride with a passing farmer who thought they were laborers. He drove them to a Hilltop Cafe, which is located on Highway 33, just over the Kingfisher County border. When the 2 women in charge of the Hilltop Cafe that day observed 2 males peering in the store's windows from the outside and inside parked automobiles, they were alarmed. Then the 2 men entered the shop. Each purchased a separate beer can. One of the clerks reported them to the Kingfisher County Sheriff's Office. Additionally, the store's only customer, a local man who was waiting for lunch, was requested to stay with the clerks until the 2 foreigners left. Officers from Kingfisher County Sheriff's Department now sprinted in the direction of the Hilltop Cafe, realizing that there might be a connection to the report of a shooting at the neighboring Kopf residence approximately 30 minutes earlier. Following the original report of a shooting, emergency services from the nearby area, together with officers from the Watonga Police Department, the Blaine County Sheriff's Office, and the Oklahoma Highway Patrol, arrived at the Kopf residence. Officers slowly made their way to the house, where they discovered the Kopf children still alive. Amber Matthews was critically injured and rendered unconscious. On a medical evacuation aircraft to a hospital in Oklahoma City, she passed away. Now walking down the road, Jesse Jones was approached by a Kingfisher County deputy sheriff and taken into custody for further investigation back at the Hilltop Cafe. After asking him a few quick questions and checking him for weapons, the deputy drove Jones back to the Hilltop Cafe. Law enforcement officials kept collecting information in the interim regarding the crimes at the Kopf residence and the strange individuals that were reported at the Hilltop. Jesse Jones was taken into custody by the police around 45 minutes later on suspicion of participating in the theft of a 4-wheeler and other offenses at the Kopf home. Wendel Grissom was later found by investigators hidden in a pile of rocks next to the Hilltop Cafe. John Hanson, 23 years on death row, after he and an accomplice abducted retired banker Mary Agnes Bowles from a Tulsa mall on August 31, 1999, Hanson is expected to be executed for the fatal shooting. The victim was 77 years old. They intended to go on a robbery rampage using her car. According to testimony at his trial, Hanson shot her in a ditch close to Owasso after the accomplice shot and killed Gerald Termain, the owner of a dirt pit, who had seen them on his land. Afterwards, he told a friend that everything went bad. Marlon Dion Harmon, 15 years on death row. In connection with Kamal Chowdhury's passing, Harmon was found guilty of first-degree murder. The 55-year-old Chowdhury owned Q&S Food Store. In the robbery of his store on August 23, 2004, he was shot 3 times and died the next day. Before Harmon was even an adult, he was incarcerated, and following his release, he committed several more robberies. Harmon was 27 years old when he received the death penalty. Donnie Lee Harris, 9 years on death row. Donnie Lee Harris was sentenced by District Court Judge John Sullivan for the death of 25-year-old Christy Ferguson on March 9, 2012. He was found guilty by the jury of dousing Ferguson with gasoline late on February 18, 2012, and then starting a fire. Ferguson was burned over 42.5% of her body, the majority of which were third-degree burns. Ferguson's injuries caused complications that led to her death 19 days later. Christy and Harris had dissolved their relationship. Harris had threatened to hurt her family if she hadn't gone with him, which is why she was there that evening. Donnie Harris expressed regret to Christy Ferguson's family as well as his own, stating he misses her every day. Christy has a son who was just 6 years old when his mother died. The boy is living with his grandmother and spends a lot of time with his grandfather as well. Raymond Eugene Johnson, 16 years on death row. In Tulsa County, Raymond Eugene Johnson was found guilty of killing both his girlfriend and her little daughter. For the 2007 murders of 24-year-old Brooke Whitaker and her 7-month-old daughter Kia, Johnson received 2 death sentences. He repeatedly struck his girlfriend with a hammer before dousing her with gasoline and setting her ablaze. The bodies of Whitaker and her daughter were discovered within the burnt remnants of their house. Johnson was also given a life sentence for arson, in addition to the death penalties. Back in 1995, he was also charged with manslaughter. Derek Tyrell Leday, 6 years on death row. Charges of first-degree murder have been brought against 2 brothers and their girlfriends for the 2015 stabbing death of an Oklahoma City man whose body was then transported and set ablaze. Dennis Johnson Jr., 34 years old, was murdered in retaliation for allegedly robbing one of the couples of cash, weapons, and drugs. Derek Tyrell Leday, his girlfriend Anna Maria Cruz, and Aaron Tyrone Leday, his girlfriend Teresa Mary McDonald, were charged with first-degree murder. In Oklahoma County District Court, the 2 couples and 4 other people were also accused with conspiring to defile and violate a human corpse. Together, the 8 moved the victim's body from Oklahoma City to Ada so that gasoline could be used to burn him. Investigators claim that the victim robbed Derek Leday and his girlfriend before the killing happened. According to a witness, Derek Leday and Cruz located the thief, brought him to a home in Oklahoma City, and fatally beat him. Derek Leday stabbed the victim and burned him, according to a different witness. On June 11, 2015, Aaron Leday, McDonald, Derek Leday, and Cruz were inside the Oklahoma City home with the victim. Johnson's body was discovered early on June 12, 2015, in Pontotoc County beneath a bridge following the extinguishment of a fire by Ada firefighters. Tiona Lynn Wilson, 20 years old at the time, of Bethany, Anthony Deshaun Franklin, 24 years old, of Ada, Eric Juarez, 17 years old, of Oklahoma City, and Halinda Rex, 17 years old, of Oklahoma City, were charged in connection with the lesser offenses. Derek Leday called Franklin on June 12, 2015, and stated he had killed a guy and needed someplace to get rid of the body. Franklin gave Derek Leday and the others instructions on where to dispose of the body when they arrived in Ada. Juarez, Rex, and Wilson, who is identified as Derek Leday's sister, were also accused with first-degree murder accessory after the fact. According to the accusations, after murdering victim Dennis Johnson, they set fire to the Leday's brothers and their girlfriend's clothes to get rid of the evidence. Derek Leday's car had 3 spots that proved to be the victim's blood. Johnson served time in prison for offenses involving drugs and domestic violence. Please hit that subscribe button if you like my channel. See you next time. Bye bye.